you could say that 2022 featured a little bit of everything. Dramatic legislative battles, high-stakes elections, major court rulings, and shock resignations. These are events that could color local and statewide politics and the lives of everyday Missourians for decades to come. So on the final edition of Politically Speaking of 2022, St. Louis Public Radio's political team counts down the 5 stories that define this year. Let's hit the music.
This is the Politically Speaking podcast, the definitive show about Missouri politics.
We have to talk about things that matter to people.
I've tried to bring that same aggressive iconoclast style with me to the United States Senate.
I think my district is a model for the state.
We put Missourians first.
You just kind of have to find the common ground with people.
I believe that this district deserves someone who represents their values.
After I came back to St. Louis, I started thinking that I could have a bigger role on the change that I wanted to make.
And welcome to Politically Speaking. I'm your host, St. Louis Public Radio's Jason Rosenbaum. This is our last Politically Speaking of the year, where we're going to be counting down our top stories that affected politics. And because of that, we have a literal full house in studio and outside of studio. Our first co-host, she covers state government for St. Louis Public Radio.
Sarah Kellogg.
Our next co-host covers economic development for St. Louis Public Radio.
Eric Schmid.
Our next co-host covers all things Rolla.
Jonathan All.
And our final co-host covers criminal justice, St. Louis politics.
Whatever they tell me to. Rachel Littman.
So this was a memorable year in the world of politics. I think every year we have to say that. Otherwise, is there really going to be a show where we're like, nothing happened this year and it was boring?
I mean, how many conversations have I had where it was like, wait, that happened this year? When did that happen?
Yeah, but as per usual, we're going to do some honorable mentions. And Rachel, all of your selections were chosen, so there's no honorable mentions for you. Sarah, you picked giant budget as one of your choices. Yeah. What was this giant budget?
Well, I mean, it was not only the surplus, but the billions of dollars in American Rescue Plan Act funding that the legislature had to figure out how to allocate this year. And it made some pretty substantial changes. I know that, Republicans were really wanting it to be one-time investments, but with the surplus, they were able to fully fund the public transportation model for the first time. They were able to give teacher raises. A lot of really big transformative changes that maybe may or may not show up this coming budget, but definitely enough to make an impact.
Jonathan, you picked Megan Green winning the Board of Aldermen President special election. Why did you choose that?
Well, I don't want to foreshadow too much, but I think it's probably related to something that did make the top 5.
Possibly, but continue.
But I would say that just having a president and a mayor who are in as close a lockstep as Jones and Green seem to be, I think is going to dramatically affect what that body does and what actually gets passed in the city in the coming years. And I thought that was incredibly significant.
I don't think any of you are going to be surprised by the fact that what he's foreshadowing is in the top 5.
Eric, you picked an investigation that you worked on about groundwater contamination as actually your number 1 story of the year.
Toot that horn, Eric.
Yeah. It's time for you to toot your horn on this really excellent and immersive story.
Thank you. Well, I in my note, too, I said it's a little self-serving, but I worked really hard on this story, so I figured that it should be my top story of the year. The reason why I picked it is because Steve Vacrot and I, we looked back decades, all stretching back into the 1980s, 1970s. That's like 40 or 50 years ago, to look at how the state failed to notify residents that their water, was potentially contaminated with a toxic chemical. And that was a top story for me because of the length of time that the state knew, that the company knew that this water was contaminated, and people didn't know. I mean, that's just a, gross, really breach of trust that the residents who we spoke with shared with us. And I think it's something that we need to pay attention to moving forward, because this isn't the only time that this chemical has been found in groundwater. It's not the only time that other chemicals are found in the ground. And, it's unfortunately a story that will repeat. And I think it's a strong case to say that we should look closer at companies who are working with toxic chemicals.
Yeah. Not to take away from the work that you did, but I refuse to believe that the 70s were 50 years ago. I'm just going to say that.
Well, even though I am the emperor of this show, one of my stories did not make it, and that was the legalization of adult use marijuana in Missouri. This is not something that I would have predicted was going to happen in Missouri 10, 15 years ago. I was skeptical that this initiative was going to pass just because I think that there is widespread opposition to people being able to purchase cannabis legally for any reason. But I was wrong, and I think this is going to have a major impact on our economy. And I do think it is notable that starting in February, you could procure 3 ounces of marijuana, go up to a police officer and say, I have 3 ounces of marijuana.
That's a lot.
And the police officer can do literally nothing.
I wouldn't have any idea how much that is.
That is.
I don't know if that's a lot or not.
Let's get into the top 5. And the number 5 story involved the rise, the fall, and the dissolution of the conservative caucus in the Missouri Senate. So, Sarah, I'm going to go to you first for this, even though I don't think this made your top 5, but this definitely...
I don't know how I missed it. I did vote for marijuana passing. Maybe that was the other one that, changed it. But yeah, it's weirdly this one missed my list.
So this definitely dominated a lot of your time in Jefferson City.
Yes.
Talk about the impact of the conservative caucus.
Well, I mean, a lot of time of it, they would say it was a clash of personalities a lot. But I mean, as you and I talked about before, Jason, it was a clash of policy. I mean, the big one this past year was the redistricting map. There was a giant fight over whether or not the congressional district should be drawn 7-1 or 6-2, and that lasted the entire session. They finished it the last day, and then the Senate left. They were like, we are done. And it got pretty nasty at times as far as like disagreements. And I mean, at one point, a majority of Republican and Democratic senators stood in front of the Senate doors and condemned the actions of the conservative caucus. So they were definitely making at least noise and making an impact where, it called for that. So it had a pretty significant impact. And so it was interesting to see them decide to dissolve the share.
Yes, and here is Senator Denny Hoskins on a recent episode of Politically Speaking talking about the decision of the conservative caucus to dissolve. Senator Hoskins was a member of that group.
Well, hopefully the impact is for the better. The conservative caucus was never meant to be something that we had that lasted a lifetime. We were just a group of conservative senators that wanted to kind of hold each other accountable and to kind of a higher standard based on the Missouri Republican Party platform. Were we clones of each other? Most certainly we were not. We both had all had our own priorities, but wanted to learn more about what it was to be, a conservative, not only in the state of Missouri, but, in the United States. And so we did dissolve. Does that mean that that I'm not going to be passionate about some of the issues? Most certainly not.
I think it's really an open question about whether the dissolution of the conservative caucus is going to lead to fewer tensions in the Senate. Eric, what do you think?
I don't think that the conservative caucus not being there is going to lead to less disillusionment. The reason I put this on my list was because of how much of a roadblock it put up for any type of legislation in the Missouri legislature to move forward. It was like redistricting was this major roadblock, and it stopped everything else from happening. And even without a conservative caucus, I'm concerned that might happen again in the future with people filibustering over, their other pet bills or pet things they don't want to see happen or want to see happen.
And I would agree with that. I think just because they are not a caucus in name doesn't mean that they don't still have that same obstructionist spirit, especially because there are more members now who could be considered part of that conservative caucus.
And that's good that you brought that up, Rachel, because, I mean, that initially I thought, well, they have kind of more conservative members won their primary, so you thought that might have bolstered it. But the reasoning that the caucus said that they're dissolving is that, well, it's shown that that's the consensus of the Republican Party Party, so they're not needed anymore. Now, I don't know how that's going to play out, come January, but that was, part of what they said their reasoning was for dissolving it.
Actually, one of the members that Sarah was alluding to is Senator-elect Ben Brown, who won his primary to represent like Franklin County in that area. Here's what he said about the conservative caucus dissolving.
So I think that this olive branch, whether, despite how it might be received by some, I think that this is what we needed to see. Whether it makes a difference in the long run or not, we don't really know. But the one thing we know is that all I've seen so far is continued escalation. This is the first thing I've seen that really symbolizes an attempt to de-escalate. And it's my hope that Republicans can take this as an opportunity to really come together, because I know there is an awful lot of common ground there if we're just willing to look for it.
Now, Jonathan, in your neck of the woods, there was a very contentious Senate race where somebody who's not part of the conservative caucus, Senator Justin Brown, was targeted by people who were in the conservative caucus, who I think that they supported Representative Susie Pollock. Do you expect people who survive those primaries, like Brown, like Mike Bernstetter in Jefferson City, to come in next year and just feel peachy keen about everything?
No, because I think that when you're an incumbent and you only win your primary by 400 votes, it gets your attention, and that's what happened to Justin Brown. It was only 400 votes, and while he did win, there's a wide swath of his party that called him a rhino. And I think that he's not going to forget that. Maybe I'm being Pollyannish, but I kind of like to hope that the dissolution of the conservative caucus sends a message that maybe standing your ground and never compromising does have a downside. And unfortunately, it just feels like in politics today, people see no downside of ridiculously holding onto your ground regardless of what other people think.
Now, let's move to number 4, which is related to number 5. And if I can get extremely technical here, there was actually a tie for third because 2 stories got 11 points. But I'm just going to say this is 4th just because of my dictatorial executive decision here, and that is Mo redistricting. It's going to surprise some longtime listeners of the show who have probably become tired of my obsession over this topic that I did not choose this as number 1.
It's not just listeners, Jason.
I chose this at number 5, and for reasons which I will explain later. Rachel, you actually had this at number 1, and can you explain why you felt like this was the biggest story of the year?
I had it at number 1 just simply because of its trickle-down impact on the way the legislative body functioned. Like Sarah mentioned, the Senate finished its map, and then it went home on the last day of session. That stranded a lot of Republican priorities not getting across the finish line, and the state House was pissed off. And I think anytime you get an issue that gums up the works so much, so hard, and led to so much of that tension that Sarah was mentioning, and the Democrats and Republicans coming together to call out the caucus, that's why I put it at 1.
It wasn't just the state House that was upset with the state Senate. Members of the Republican Party in the state Senate were fed up with each other, as seen as from this very memorable exchange between Senators Bob Onder and Elaine Gannon earlier this year.
It is almost our session is almost over, Senator. We only have a matter of hours left.
But I would agree.
And most of the people in this room are fed up. And I think everybody in here knows who we're fed up with.
Okay.
And you know what? You're outnumbered.
Sarah, I was actually I was actually not working through most of the drama over redistricting because I was on leave taking care of my baby. But I can tell you that some of the audio that I listened to for fun was highly entertaining and probably helped put Del Todd Rosenbaum to sleep. How entertaining was this for you?
Well, when you have to be there and covering it and you can't go home, it's a little less fun. It was, I mean, interesting just to see this division. I mean, this was the last week. I know you're there, Jason, for it, but I was like, this is an exchange that we have to use because it just showed the reflection of it. So, and the reason why, and just to do a little bit of a pivot, the reason why I picked it, because I did pick this, was actually on the statewide maps. So the state Senate and the state House maps for that were drawn by independent committees. And the reason why I picked that is because it made more competitive districts, and actually House members were able to pick up 3 seats this year, and that's pretty significant. So I'm curious to see kind of down the road how these maps are going to go, because there are more competitive districts now.
Now, while I was highly enthused about how much attention redistricting was getting, especially congressional redistricting, the reason why I did not put it that high on my list is especially the congressional map, to me, is kind of status quo. Everybody knew that the 2nd Congressional District, which includes St. Louis County, St. Charles County, Franklin, and Warren County that Ann Wagner represents, it was going to get more Republican, and it did. And I just think that the overall impact was not as seismic, even though I think it was entertaining.
I would agree with that. The reason that this Missouri redistricting didn't make it onto my list was because in many ways it was much ado about nothing. There was this big acrimonious fight over what are we going to do with this map? Is it going to be 7-1? Is it going to be 6-2? And then at the very end of the day, it ended up being the same thing that we had seen for the past decade. And that makes it kind of a boring story at the very end.
But I will say, Jonathan, there was a Rolla element that did actually have some drama to it. And it was about whether to put Fort Leonard Wood as well as some other military bases into the 8th district, or whether to split it between the 4th. And I think that, and it ended, I think Fort Leonard Wood is still in the 4th after redistricting.
They're both in the same district now. And that
Wait,
was...
they put Whiteman and the Fort in the same district?
Yes.
Yes,
and
that was a priority for Senator Hoskins and a lot of people.
Which is very bizarre because I guess in my mind, if you have 2 people in the House in D.C. that are very, very interested in preserving Missouri military stuff, you have 2 votes. If you only have 1, then you have 1 vote. Unless the goal was to make sure that the 2 Congress members didn't, go back and forth. But, I mean, it seems very bizarre to want both of them in the same district to me, because I feel like the people who live in Rolla or in St. Robert or in Waynesville have more in common with the people who are on post at Fort Leonard Wood than the people who are on post at Fort Leonard Wood have in common with the people on post at White.
Well, I mean, my house in Richmond Heights probably has more in common with St. Louis City and inner ring suburbs than it does with Warren County, but I'm in the 2nd Congressional District now thanks to the magic of markers that draw these districts. But
the geography of that district is just what's getting me. Like, I can understand military bases and having similar interests there. It's more just the geography.
Well, compared to Illinois, though, they look compact and contiguous.
Okay, accurate, but
right. And also, I just as an aside before we go to the next one, Eric, I mean, the Democratic plan to maximize their gains and their holds that we talked about last year worked immaculately this year. And the reason why Democrats have a smaller minority is because of Illinois Democrats.
Well, and also because they didn't overstretch. There was some push to make a map in Illinois that would produce 15 seats that would go to the Democrats. The one that is currently in place would have produced 14 seats for Democrats from Illinois. And in talking with a redistricting analyst, somebody who just looks at the numbers, he's like 15-2 would be impossible to defend and leave slim margins all over the place. So yeah, I mean, as you say, it puts, it worked to perfection. We'll have to see if that holds up over the next 10 years, based off of how people move around the state, which parts grow, which parts recede, and if certain people, if certain voting blocks start voting in different ways than they did in 2020 or 2022.
And which ones succeed.
Let's go to number 3, which is the Republican Senate primary. Notice we're not talking the Senate race. We're talking specifically about the Republican Senate primary, which was won by Attorney General Eric Schmitt, and you can hear part of his triumphant victory speech in August here.
This election can change the course of the country and save our republic. And I am going to Washington on a mission to protect freedom and opportunity for the next generation, for my kids, for your kids. We should leave them with an inheritance. The birthright of every American is freedom.
This was one of the wildest primaries I've ever covered. It's probably doesn't beat Mo 9 in 2008 with Brock Olivo and Blaine Luchtenmeyer and Bob Onder, hating each other. But this included, I think, 5 or 6 candidates that were considered viable. But really, it came down to 3 in the end. It was Schmidt, Congresswoman Vicky Hartzler, and former Governor Eric Greitens. And I'll just be very candid. Greitens' reemergence was very stressful, just because he just produces a lot of content for us, and some of it which is frankly pretty disturbing. But it was notable to me that he lost very decisively, probably because the third-party ads talking about his child custody case with his ex-wife were just so devastating. Sarah, what's kind of your thoughts on how that primary proceeded?
I think it's hard to say. I think there was a lot of just attention on it because of the Greitens factor, but I think that ultimately being out of politics, Schmidt having that, recognition as AG, I think in the end of it, it was kind of an inevitability, and the end result was not super surprising, and that led to a pretty easy general.
Jonathan, were you surprised Greitens didn't do better in rural Missouri? I thought that before the ads, there was still a contingent of people, specifically in rural Missouri and especially in southeast Missouri, that were planning on voting for him, and it just didn't happen.
Okay, well, first of all, rural Missouri isn't a monolith, and the fact that you had 2 Congress members who represent large swaths of rural Missouri that were in that race, I'm not surprised at all. Because, if it had only been a one-on-one race between Greitens and Schmidt, how he would have played outside Greitens would have played outside the metro areas would have been interesting. For me, I think the most interesting thing in this primary outside of Eric Greitens was that think about the allure of being a senator, because Vicky Hartzler and Billy Long could have been in Congress as long as they wanted to. They were never going to get beat by anybody. But they chose to give that all away for a shot in a contested primary that was really, really an uphill fight for both of them. So, man, talk about the allure of wanting to be in the Senate.
I was like, and Hartzler ended up placing second above Greitens. And I think that also the fact that he had vocal opposition from Hartzler, where, none of the other candidates would say this, but she was the one who said, if Greitens is the nominee, I am not voting for him. So I wonder kind of how much of a message that ended up being as well.
Well, and that's what is interesting to me is, Schmidt talks about going to Washington with a mission and the allure of the Senate, but he's going to be a freshman in the minority, and that does dampen his power and his ability to be on this mission. He can do more, whether you are a supporter or a detractor of his, more good, more damage, depending on how you look at it, as the Attorney General. He has more power as Missouri Attorney General than he does as, a senator. Does he have a larger platform being a senator? Does it make for a platform to higher office? Potentially. But just in terms of his ability to carry out his mission, as he said in his victory speech, it's lessened by being one of 100 in, the freshman class in the minority.
And that's true. That was a big part. Well, a big part of his campaign, too, was he's the guy who's doing something. I'm the person who's filing the lawsuits. I'm, challenging the Biden administration on, schools, on student debt relief, all of these hot button issues for Missouri Republicans. Schmidt was out there waving the flag, saying he was the one fighting for those things. And I agree with you, Rachel, that getting into the Senate, it's a lot harder to really demonstrate viscerally in the way that he did in the primary to show that he's doing something. And that's what I feel really resonated with many portions of the state, was that they could point to him and say, he's doing something. He is taking action, whereas these other people, I can't really tell if they are.
Now, the reason why we're just talking about the primary is from the moment Schmidt declared victory, I think reporters, Republicans, and frankly Democrats knew that the general was over. That Trudy Bush Valentine, while she put up a notable effort, spent I think around $18 million of her own money, had no chance of winning. And I think a large part of the reason why people had no faith in her was just the geographic reality in Missouri. It's not only that Democrats are doing horribly in rural Missouri, they're also failing to gain any ground in places like Jefferson County. They're not really gaining a lot of meaningful ground in St. Charles or places like Buchanan County. And when I was talking with former Senator Wes Schumeyer for a story about how the 6th District has become a Republican stronghold, and particularly Northeast Missouri, he had this insight that I really hadn't thought about before.
The state parties, I think I always thought that unlimited campaign contributions really, especially in the Democratic Party, hurt us a lot because, those with power wanted, and money was power, and that power centralized in individual campaigns and individuals instead of in a party. And so your infrastructure, Democrats whenever since I began running, ever kept continuity in their party like Republicans did. They kept continuity, and that continuity built relationships out across the state. Those relationships evolved into results and things happening over and over, where you didn't have to rework everything. And now, you have to be a miracle worker to make all the contacts that you need to get the signs up and all those things that need to happen.
What do you all think of what former Senator Schumeyer said?
Does anybody know who Randy McCallion is?
She is the Democratic nominee in the 8th Congressional District.
Yes, and who really was trounced by Jason Smith. But since the election, she has been incredibly vocal about how the state Democratic Party is just ignoring rural Missouri. They're not even trying. And she even made some noise about running for vice chair of the party. And the chair of the party pretty much said, "Get out of here. You're talking smack about us. You're not worth our time." And I think that when you can, and Jason, you've said this numerous times, it's not that Democrats need to win rural Missouri, but you got to do better than 20%, or you're not going to win any statewide offices. And I can tell you that Democrats have given up on rural Missouri, and I have a hard time seeing that as a strategy that's ever going to be successful.
We'll be right back after this quick break with the year in review in 2022 for Politically Speaking. And we're back on Politically Speaking, where we are counting down the top 5 political stories of 2022. So let's get into the number 2 story, and we kind of alluded to this in the beginning, and that is Indictment-O-Rama in St. Louis. This was quite a turn of events. I think Rachel and I had heard rumors that there were indictments coming. I had even heard rumors that it was going to be multiple people, but I kind of didn't believe it. And in the end, St. Louis Board of Aldermen President Lewis Reed, former Alderman John Collins Muhammad, and Alderman Jeffrey Boyd were all indicted in this bribery scheme. They all stepped down, and they are all going to jail. And I have to say, this has had a huge impact on St. Louis politics, because the legislative branch in St. Louis City, I think, is really powerful. I think this is a game changer for city politics, Rachel. What do you think?
I would agree with that, just simply because the indictments, first of all, took out 2 incredibly, powerful, long-tenured senior Black aldermen in Jeffrey Boyd and Lewis Reed. And Lewis Reed, leaving office, stepping down under pressure, opened the door for Megan Green to come in and run and win board president in a fashion that if you'd said 4, 5, 6 years ago that a candidate as liberal as Megan Green could win so handily in a citywide race, people, I think, would have laughed at you. And as of right now, she is going into the March primary unopposed. Nobody has filed to run against her yet. There's still a couple of weeks left to collect signatures and submit and file for that election. But, to go from losing that race, she ran in a three-way primary for board president in 2019, I believe.
Yes.
And now she is potentially having a clear shot to the office. And like Jonathan mentioned earlier, to have a president and a mayor and occasionally a comptroller who are in lockstep on more progressive policies has the potential to change the city.
Here is actually Mayor Tashara Jones talking exactly about that on a recent edition of St. Louis on the Air.
Well, for the first time in St. Louis's history, we'll have 3 women represented on the Board of Estimate and Apportionment. And women tend to govern in a different way. We think about who's not at the table. We think about families. We lead with compassion, and I'm not saying that men don't, but we just govern different. And we now have a partner between all three offices. We'll have regional collaboration not only at the city level but also regionally. So we'll be able to work on things that we agree on, and when we disagree, we'll do it without becoming disagreeable.
I think what the mayor is saying there really rings true when you look back on the just level of acrimony on the Board of Estimate and Apportionment when it came to ARPA funds being allocated for specific projects in North St. Louis City. When, it was dragged out, and in sitting, I guess, it was dragged out for a long time. And when you listen to some of those meetings, it would be Darlene Green and Mayor Tashara Jones on one side saying, we have to do this, we have to do this way, we have to make sure that it's done right. And then Lewis Reed saying, almost throwing up any roadblock possible to slow down those funds being portioned out. And without Lewis Reed in the picture and moving Megan Green in, who is this tight ally of Tashara Jones, makes it so some of those priorities can go through a lot faster, and we won't be waiting months and months and months for something for a priority of the marriage to actually go through.
Jonathan, you actually picked this as your number one story of the year. Mm-hmm. I'd like to hear why.
Well, I think for the long-term ramifications, because I do think that that cleaning house of a certain number of aldermen, especially after wards are declining and the body is going to get smaller, totally reshapes St. Louis politics. I think that Jones and Green have a huge opportunity to pass a progressive agenda. I also think they have an uphill battle in that for a lot of people, when government officials get indicted and then plead guilty, a lot of people can't see past, well, what side of the issues were you on? It's just politicians are dirty. And especially from outside of St. Louis, it plays to the narrative, true or not, that St. Louis politicians are just dirty, rotten scoundrels. And I think that while Green and Jones have a huge opportunity, it's going to be difficult, and they have an uphill battle because they're going to have to make up for the sins of other people. And I think it's just a reality of the way that people perceive politics.
All local politics is full of dirty, rotten scoundrels. I think the other thing, too, that is going to be interesting is the opportunity, whether it is taken or not, to really change the way the city hands out incentives. Part of what generated this was the need for aldermen to, whether it was by custom or by policy, approve every step of the incentive process. And it gave leverage or demand points for those who wanted to do ill. And does this become part of a overall changing the development strategy, not only in terms of incentives, but also what goes where and what investments are made where?
The other thing that is important to remember is that this comes at a time when St. Louis, the city of St. Louis County is flush with cash from a variety of sources. There's ARPA money that has to be appropriated by 2024, spent by 2026. There's money from the RAM settlement. There's bipartisan infrastructure money. There's Inflation Reduction Act money. There's CHIPS Act money. I mean, there are billions of dollars on the table for the city and the region in general to invest in a way that the mayor would say drives transformational change for decades to come. And what I see in these indictments in changing this paradigm also means that now if the city can move in a way that is consistent, then the city and county might be able to move in a way that is consistent, in a way that has not really happened since I've been here, and probably a lot longer before then too.
There are times in St. Louis and St. Louis County where white progressives and African Americans team up, and you see things like Wesley Bell getting elected, but then you see the St. Louis County Council where those two entities are at war with each other.
And that's true on the St. Louis Board of Aldermen, too, sometimes.
And I don't know. I know that Tashara Jones is this hybrid person who appeals both to African American voters and white progressives. I just wonder if there could be something that comes down the line that causes a schism. Because let's not memory hold this. Louis Reed and Megan Green were allies until the St. Louis Stadium debacle in 2015.
That's true. And the mayor and the board president were not always close either. I forgot which race it was that they fell out over, but she did mention in her inaugural address, having to work through some of the issues raised in that race. But at this point, who knows? Obviously, the, quote unquote unicorn candidate could come in where the mayor may split from the board president. But realistically, I don't know that is going to happen unless something else happens.
So let's move to the number one story of the year. It happened in late June when the U.S. Supreme Court struck down Roe versus Wade. And Banyan Lee Gilmore, who is with Planned Parenthood of the St. Louis region and Southwest Missouri, told me this on an episode of St. Louis on the Air an hour or so after the decision came down.
This is the end of the line for abortion care for the 1.3 million people of reproductive age in the state of Missouri. That trigger ban has forced us into stopping services. That being said, we are continuing full force ahead at our Fairview Heights, Illinois Health Center in the Metro East, where we are bracing for impact and a large influx of patients who will soon be turning to that health center from across the Midwest and South.
Sarah, this was your number one story. This was my number one story as well. Why do you think that this should have been the top one for 2022?
For the repercussions that it has. I mean, Missouri was the first one after the ruling to make abortion illegal in most cases in Missouri. And now we're going to kind of see, the results of that. Again, you cannot get an abortion in cases of rape or incest. It's only in medical emergencies. I mean, and as far as like covering it from a statewide legislature, there's going to be, the success is debatable, but there will be attempts from Democrats to reverse at least the rape and incest portions of that. There will be maybe even legislation that's going to try to further the ban related to medical abortions that you can get through the mail. There's a bill filed that would give you a tax deduction if you're pregnant. There's lots of legislation that's going to shape it, and it has such a monumental effect on just everyday Missourians that it couldn't be anything else for my number one.
Now, Eric, I know you spent a lot of years covering the Metro East and Illinois politics. Even though we're going to primarily talk about how this affects Missouri, it would be remiss if I didn't say the obvious. I don't think a Republican will ever be elected governor of Illinois again, because there's always going to be the attack that they're going to ban abortion in Illinois, which is very unpopular. Am I wrong here?
Likely not. And also banning abortion would be particularly hard to do in Illinois because it would have to the state legislature codified the right to an abortion in Illinois in 2019, and that you would have to go through the legislature. You'd have to have a Republican as governor and then also be able to get that through the legislature, which is unlikely given how the maps are drawn to give Democrats super majorities in both chambers of the legislature there. The other thing that I think is important to remember, even though we are talking a lot about Missouri, is that Illinois has now become this refuge state for basically all of its neighbors to the Midwest, to the South. There are a handful of clinics in Carbondale, very, very southern Illinois, other places looking to open up clinics just across the border, kind of like a ring around, the Illinois border to make it accessible. And even in the Metro East, there are a couple facilities, and they're seeing tens of thousands, or they say they're seeing tens of thousands of of requests, of people who are coming from thousands of miles away for this type of medical procedure.
But Jonathan, I think that the biggest impact of this decision is that if you live outside of St. Louis or Kansas City, and you don't have access to transportation and you want to get an abortion, it's become a little bit more difficult now. It was probably difficult before.
No, I look, because I don't think it's that. I don't think that's quite true, because up until this reversal, the only place to get an abortion in Missouri was in St. Louis. So now instead of driving an hour and a half, you drive an hour 45. And I don't know that that's that big a difference. The people in outstate Missouri have been denied abortion services for a long time. I think the more bigger and interesting thing that this is going to do, outside of the very important decision of whether people should have reproductive rights, is that the Republicans are up against it now. They really are, because it's very easy for the Republicans to say we're pro-life. It's a much different story when you have some Republicans who are saying you should be prosecuted for murder if you drive somebody across the border and help them get an abortion in Illinois. That is a completely different thing. And I think that the zealots who are on the extreme end of this issue are going to see this as an opportunity to push even further. And I think they're going to find a lot of opposition in their own party that's like, whoa, you need to pump the brakes on this.
I think, going back to, I would want to clarify about in terms of difficulty and access for people who are in more rural parts of Missouri. Yeah, they can drive an hour 45 to Illinois to get this medical procedure done. The difficulty is that now you have all of these people from much further away than rural Missouri also trying to go to the same facilities. And so, and there are only 7 days in a week and however many hours a day that the clinics are open to, schedule these consultations and, procedures, all of that stuff.
But I think that the Planned Parenthood started building that new facility in Fairview Heights because they saw this coming. They started putting in motion mobile units because they saw this coming. Not to say that they were able to meet the demand, but I think it's closer than maybe some people are giving it credit for, because it's not like the one remaining in St. Louis did that many abortions.
It didn't, no. But I do think from a political perspective, there's going to be reverberations beyond 2022. There is a lot of talk now about gathering signatures to put something into the Constitution that would repeal the 2019 abortion ban and replace it with something else. There's like counter moves to try to make the Constitution harder to amend, and it's possible if it's timed right, that could stymie that type of thing.
Well, also look at Kansas and look at Kentucky, both states that voted opposing basically bans on abortion in their constitutions. And I think also the idea of it's a risk. Well, what happens if you put it on the ballot and then it doesn't pass? Then it just doesn't pass. It's not like the opposite result happens.
I'm kind of torn on this question because I've heard a lot of supporters of abortion rights say that there's widespread support for legal abortion in the state. And I think if you ask somebody, should somebody be able to terminate a pregnancy who's been raped or a victim of incest or whose health is in danger? I think the answer is probably 70, 80% yes. But I think if it's not for one of those exceptions, depending on where you go, I don't think it's as clear-cut of an answer. I think that there is some real anti-abortion rights sentiment among Missouri voters that has resulted in a legislature that is very hostile to abortion rights. And I think it's kind of embedded in some religious convictions and also just kind of the conservative tilt of some of these places.
Jason.
Okay.
5 years ago, would you have imagined that this state would say, yeah, you can smoke pot?
No.
So there you go.
Yeah. And the other thing, too, is that it's a hypothetical until it happens. And what happens if they see the impact of Missouri's language in their own communities? It's great, grand, and wonderful for the dog to chase the car. It's what happens when the dog catches the car. And the dog has now caught the car, and it's a question of what are the impacts and the fallout of that.
How far is that car going to take the dog?
Depends on the size of the car and the dog.
I will just say this.
Let's keep torturing this metaphor.
Let's just say that my aforementioned allusion to the Missouri Constitution being harder to amend doesn't end up happening. and this initiative is on the 2024 general election ballot, it's going to create a massively different dynamic for the governor's race and the U.S. Senate race than this year. I'm not saying that Democrats are going to be able to win those races if they can't solve the geography problem I mentioned. But Sarah, I mean, it could really change turnout in what's going to be a presidential election, which is already going to have a high turnout to begin with.
Yes, I think that you're correct on all those accounts. I think that, the idea of having abortion on the ballot, the right to an abortion, or, there could be an effort to make sure. I know that there was a resolution filed that basically says you could never put the right to an abortion in a constitution. So there could be lots of scenarios that either get people to vote for or against something. My question is, this is a statute, and I know that a lot of the grumbling over initiative petition reform has been on changing the Constitution. Do you think people would maybe try to go for changing the statute instead, or would that just kind of be a back and forth volley
or a referendum? Yeah.
I think the problem is that if that passed, let's just say it was a statutory change, the legislature could come back months later and just put it back into place.
But now that it's in fact, do you think then they would just try to make it more palatable, include exceptions for rape and incest? I'm curious as to kind of how that process would go.
Thank you all for joining us on what is always my favorite show of the year, not only because I love reminiscing, but it's also just great to talk with all the people that have been involved in St. Louis Public Radio's amazing politics coverage this year and prior years. Thank you to Aaron Dorr for engineering this episode. And thank you for Sarah for joining us remotely. Politically Speaking is a product of St. Louis Public Radio, which is a part of the University of Missouri St. Louis. You can read all of our stories at STLPR.org. We'll be back in 2023. So long.
I said we didn't talk about the endorsement of Eric. We should have. I'm so mad I didn't bring that up in the primary because that was the funniest thing.
I'll include it in the feature.